Right, so good evening everyone, and welcome to Take Charge for May of 2015. Now, I think I can safely say that most of us here know all about coronary artery disease. We know what happens if you get a blockage in one of your coronary arteries and it restricts blood flow. It can cause angina, cause arrhythmias, cause heart attacks, require angioplasty, surgery. It's important that your heart gets all the oxygen-rich blood that it needs, so we view narrowings as a bit of a bad thing. But has anyone ever thought what happens to if you've got blockages in blood vessels away from your heart? Because it's not only your heart that needs oxygen-rich blood, right? Every cell in your body does. So what happens if you start building up blockages in other parts of your body? Kind of an interesting question. That's our topic for today, okay? Our speaker tonight is Dr. Andrew Dewick, and Dr. Dewick received his medical training at Queen's University, and then did his fellowship in vascular surgery here at University of Toronto, then did a little bit more specialized training in Arizona, I believe, and then he came back home. And currently Dr. Dewick is the Chief of Vascular Surgery next door at Sunnybrook. Dr. Dewick, all yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks for having me here tonight. I have to say I feel a little bit overdressed, and I think I messed up my day because actually just before this I went for a little run, a little exercise myself, and then I had a little cleanup, and here I am. So next time maybe I'll just come here and do the run here, and that way, you know, everybody's happy. So I'm going to talk about, there's a couple major things that we deal with in vascular surgery. One is clogged arteries, and one is arteries that have a tendency to explode. It's kind of a 50-50 about which kind of talk I give at things like this. So tonight, I think I'm going to talk about aneurysms, and those are arteries that are larger than they can be. And I'm going to talk about how we fix them in the past, how we fix them in the remote past, the more recent past, and some of the things that we're working on now. So I hope you find that interesting. So again, we're going to talk about the past, the present, and the future. So why bother with this problem? Well, unfortunately, it turns out that about 5 to 10% of the population of men, anyway, it's much more common in men than women, have an aneurysm, an aortic aneurysm. It's more common in the patient, in people over 60, and the trouble is this artery gets bigger unbeknownst to the patient, unbeknownst to you, and then one day it can rupture. If it ruptures, that's bad. You're in hot water, and most patients don't survive. Here's a couple of people who have had rupture aneurysms and not survived. That's Albert Einstein on the top there. That's Charles de Gaulle there. That's Gordon Lightfoot. And Bob Dole also had an aneurysm. So it's the sort of thing that perhaps people haven't necessarily heard as much about as heart disease or something like that, but it's a very important problem. In the distant past, on the left, what you see is a syphilis, an organism that causes syphilis. And this, a lot of people had syphilis, as it turns out, in the 1700s and 1800s. And it would cause these aneurysms in the thoracic aorta, these holes in the wall of the thoracic aorta. Look a little bit like that. You don't have to go to medical school to spot where the problem is there. That does not look proper, and indeed it is not. And that has a tendency to rupture. So the cutting edge care circa 1880 rather, and this is true if you can believe it, they would feed enormous lengths of copper wire into that area of the aorta that was blown apart. The idea is that if you feed enough of this wire in there, it just fills up with this wire, a big blood clot forms, maybe the problem will go away. Wow. So it's a little hard to imagine, but that's what they did. And there's one paper from a fellow who got 100 feet of copper wire into an aneurysm. So I wonder if perhaps he was just feeding it out the patient's ear. But in any event, that's what he said he did. The wire, again, was supposed to make these things clot off and go away. Let's just say the results were mixed. About 20 years later, 20 or 30 years later, this fella came along. His name is Carrel, and he won a Nobel Prize for showing that you could sew two arteries together and have them continue to work. That doesn't sound like rocket science for people in this room, many of whom perhaps had bypass surgery in the past. But you know, in 1912, that was a really revolutionary thing. We didn't know that. We didn't know we could sew two drinking straws together and still drink out of it. And he won a Nobel Prize for that. That was great for small arteries, but if a large artery is damaged, there was nothing to replace that large artery with. Now we're looking around the body for spare parts. we don't have a spare part that's the size of a garden hose. So his discovery, while incredible and groundbreaking, it was really limited to fixing small arteries. In the not so distant past, so now we're moving ahead by a good 40 years, it wasn't syphilis that was causing the problem anymore. We had antibiotics to take care of that problem. It was this fella on the left, cigarettes. And so people began to smoke, or people had always smoked, and this began to become an issue. And the aneurysms changed a little bit. Number one, they changed their shape. Instead of that horrible little hole in the aneurysm and the whole thing looking quite awful, they now looked, we call them fusiform or football shaped. So instead of one area of the aorta just kind of blown apart, the whole thing was kind of bigger than it should be. And their location changed as well. Rather than being way up here in the aortic arch or in the thoracic aorta, they tended to be in the abdominal aorta, in the abdomen, or in the thoracic aorta, in the descending thoracic aorta, after the aortic arch made that turn. So it was a bit of a different pattern. This is a scanning electron micrograph of a product called Dacron. Dacron was it's a synthetic product that was invented by the DuPont Corporation in the early 1900s, but nobody really knew what to do with it. So they just kind of put it in a box and put it in a shelf and did nothing with it. And about 45 years later, they took that box out and they started looking at it and playing with it and perfecting it. And people started to think, hey, maybe there could be uses for this, and maybe one of the uses could be medical. We talked about how we didn't have a spare part to use to replace the aorta. Well, maybe this product, this fabric, could be made into tubes and be used as a spare part. And that happened around 1950. That was a big deal. That was a really big deal because meanwhile, by the way, anesthetic and patient care had improved a lot as well. So now we could do this operation, actually have a hope that the patient would survive the operation, and we had a piece of garden hose. We now had garden hose at our disposal, and this changed everything. What you're seeing here on the bottom right, I don't know, perhaps some people can't see it, that's Dr. DeBakey, who is quite a famous vascular surgeon initially and later cardiac and vascular surgeon. And I don't know how well it projects, but he's got these sheets of Dacron, and he used to fashion them into tubes on his wife's sewing machine. Imagine doing this today, by the way. The hospital, I think, would shoot us. But he would fashion these on his wife's sewing machine. He'd bring them into the hospital the next day, sterilize them, put them in the patient in the afternoon. I mean, you know, you talk about pace of innovation. I mean, that's just, that's pretty incredible. And there he is. He's got the scissors going and, you know, a couple branches on that one. I really like that picture because, you know, that was research ethics in 1952. That's what you did. You asked your wife if you could use her sewing machine. It was great.
What's the life expectancy of a patient that had that done?
Well, if they recovered from the operation, which we can talk about in a little bit, they actually did quite well. The key was recovering from the operation. Not so easy to get in there to fix it. Everything looks really simple and straightforward in a cartoon. You just draw that little cartoon, you go, just do that part there, done. Yes, of course, and a cartoon makes it look very simple, but the reality of it can be much more complicated. Of course, he started doing this. This was in Texas. Texas very quickly became one of the world centers for this sort of surgery as well, Paris in France. It became the standard of care, and he went on to many subsequent successes. And after heparin was invented, heparin is a blood thinner. It was invented in Toronto. After heparin was invented, heart surgery became possible, and he started working on that as well and became quite well known. There's a picture of him in Time magazine. He actually died at the age of 99 after having his aorta replaced with Dacron. Between 1950, 55, and let's say 2000, 2005, very little changed. We make a big incision in the abdomen. Unfortunately, the aorta happens to be at the back, so we've got to move everything else out of the way, all the bowels and the organs. Finally get down to the bottom of the trunk there, operate on the aorta, put clamps on, and fix the aorta, and then close the patient back up again. It did work very well, and it certainly was better than feeding 100 feet of copper wire into something. But it is a major operation, and major complications were a big part of the problem. Obviously, you have a large incision. That takes a lot to recover from on its own. Pulmonary complications, you can get pneumonia after the operation. Heart complications, it's a big stress on the heart, and you can have a heart attack during or after the operation. and you could require a blood transfusion during the operation. And initially, a blood transfusion was quite common. Over time, we developed better techniques, and some of these complications started to come down. And eventually, we got really good at it. We're really good at it today, but you just can't get around the fact that you're making that big incision in someone. I mean, there's only so good that that's ever going to be. This is a picture of a roof or ceiling. And if you can imagine that there's a problem in the pipes in one of the ceiling, and that's what you're looking at, that doesn't seem too difficult, does it? You just pop off one of those tiles, you go in there, you fix the problem, you put the tile back. But the problem is a patient's abdomen is not that kind of roof. A patient's abdomen is that kind of roof. And if there's a problem with the pipe behind there, we're going to have an issue. We'll just chip off that part right where the fingers are touching maybe and put it back together. No, there's going to be people who disagree with that and think maybe we can't do that. And that's what we're dealing with. We don't want to disturb the patient's normal physiology. We don't want to disturb the patient's abdomen because it's difficult to put back together. It's impossible to put back together exactly the way it was. Yes, we can do a very good job, but no, it's never exactly the same. So here's what we've come up with. A lot of work has been done to answer the question, well, why do these aneurysms happen? Just because you smoke? How come not everybody who smokes gets an aneurysm? Well, there's a huge genetic component to this. It's not completely understood, but we do know that part of the wall of the aorta is abnormal, and over time, and especially for men, and especially if you smoke, the artery can become weaker, and you can get these weak spots in the aneurysm that grow. In the early 1990s, this is a picture of a fellow named Juan Perotti, and he had an idea that was very unpopular. His idea was, well, I got an idea. Forget this garden hose market. Let's take a stent, let's crush it down, put it into something about the size of a highlighter, ram it up through the femoral artery in the leg up to where the spot where the football is, and let it go. And we're going to fix everything from the inside. It turned out that was a very good idea, but he faced a lot of resistance at first. The early devices that he made were homemade things. He took a little bit of chicken wire and a little bit of graft, just like you saw DeBakey doing, and he was trying to use those, and they didn't work very well. They failed often, and often immediately. The patient had to go for a big operation anyway to take this thing out. But you know what? Companies saw this and said, well, that looks like a pretty good idea, and they started designing stents specifically for this purpose. And then you had second generation, third generation. We're on to fourth and fifth generation devices. And like everything in life, they just get better over time. These devices are very slick now. They don't fall apart. They're relatively straightforward to implant, and it makes a big difference. Need is the mother of invention. So this is a picture of the printing press. It's one of my favorite pictures. And you might ask, like, how come it took so long to invent the printing press? Why didn't they invent that a lot earlier? That could have helped us out quite a bit. Well, the answer is nobody could read. They invented the printing press pretty quickly after there was a base level of people being able to read. What's the point of a printing press? Nobody can read. Yes, well, once literacy rates hit about 10, 20% of the population, all of a sudden there's a need for that, and it was invented. The trouble with shoving a big stent inside the femoral artery and hoping for the best is you really need to be able to see what you're doing. And when we do open surgery, we open the abdomen, we look at things directly, we're just looking. But now we need to have specialized imaging to be able to see what we're going to do before we do it. We need to take a lot of different measurements so we make sure to order the right part. These devices come in modular components. There's 55,000 different combinations of ways to put them together, and there's one solution for as an individual patient. So we developed a variety of imaging techniques. Most of them are based on having a CT scan, and you have a CT scan, the arteries light up, and we're able to do imaging like this, which is a stress analysis of the wall of the artery. It tells us which part of the artery is vulnerable to rupture and if this thing is likely or unlikely to rupture. But beyond just these diameter measurements, we take this kind of data, which is a bunch of kind of cuts, and this is what CT scans used to look like in the 80s and 90s, and we create something that looks like this, which is incredible. And a piece of software that sits on my desk, it takes this and goes to that in about 9 seconds. It's pretty amazing. You hit a button and the computer goes, thinks about it for a while, and it spits out something that looks like this. This has a lot of advantages. It's nice to look at, sure, but it also allows us to take very accurate diameter measurements, and you can see those arteries aren't straight, but the computer is very clever about drawing a line even down something that's not straight, and we can take distance measurements so we know what kind of distances we're dealing with. Very important. So okay, that's fine. So that's how we're going to tell what we're doing beforehand, how to order the right parts. Well, how are we going to install them? This is a picture of Röntgen. He was a German guy who invented x-rays, or discovered x-rays, I suppose. And in his time, the x-ray machines were not so great. They've come a long way. The dose of radiation required has gone down, and the resolution, the quality of the pictures that we see has gone way up. But we still use x-rays, and that's one thing that we're always trying to think of ways that we could do this procedure without using any radiation, without using any x-rays. This is the state-of-the-art kind of facility that we have now. It's a special floating table, we call it. It's radiolucent, which means you can take x-rays through it, and the patient lies on the table, and this C-arm, this x-ray machine, rotates around the patient. We're able to see what we're doing in real time. So by doing things this way, it's much safer for the patient. We don't have to make this large incision. So instead of staying in the hospital for 7 to 10 days, perhaps going to rehab, and typically recovering over 2 to 3 months, most patients actually, they have 2 incisions at the top of each leg. They go home the next day. Are they completely normal the next day? No, of course not. But over a week or two, almost all patients are kind of back to their normal routine, and I would say 90 to 95% recovered. So that's a pretty significant advance. Okay, how about the future? What are we going to do in the future? I can't actually remember why I put this in, but it's a beautiful photo, so I guess we can all appreciate it for a while. I think it was some idea about the Great Wall of China was built because the emperor said the empire must have limits. We must draw a limit around what we are going to do and go no further, but we don't do that. You know, we always are wondering what's on the other side of the fence. So we want to evolve again. We want to do more with even less. There's a picture of Charles Darwin. And I remember when I was studying biology before I was in medical school, there's 2 kind of ideas of how evolution happens. One is gradualism. Things slowly change. The butterfly wings change color a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. And then, you know, over millions of years, they change color. The other theory is, no, it's punctuated evolution. Something happens, and there's an immediate need for something, and all of a sudden the printing press is invented. They didn't invent one letter at a time. They invented the whole thing all at once. And it turns out punctuated equilibrium or punctuated evolution is the way that evolution usually occurs, and it's no different for us. There's a picture of, I don't know, evolution of grass-eating mammals from my undergraduate evolution textbook. So we went from copper wire, but all of a sudden we had Dacron. And when we had Dacron, we could do open repair. Once we had endografts, we could do these endovascular repairs, these repairs from the inside using the x-ray machine and the small incisions. That allows us to do even more and more complicated things. You know, we actually, I have to say, I made fun of the copper wire, but we still use a version of that. We, of course, don't call it shoving copper wire into people anymore because that wouldn't be very medical. So we call them endovascular coils or coil embolization. So if we do have funny shaped aneurysms, we stuff them full of these coils, and you know what? They do thrombose and go away. So maybe I shouldn't make too much fun of it. As you can see, we have the open repair as well. And where do we go from there? Well, you know, okay. Oh, it's time for me to go home. That's what that means. So where do we go from endovascular repair? Well, you know what? All of a sudden we had all kinds of other ideas. Instead of just doing endovascular repair in the abdominal aorta, we started doing endovascular repair in the thoracic aorta. Now instead of avoiding an abdominal incision, we're avoiding a big incision in the chest. It's even more of a dramatic difference for patients. We also started repairing heart valves this way. Hey, what if we had not just a stent like a hollow stent? What if we had just a short piece of stent, but inside that stent was a heart valve? Oh, yes, we can do that. Also dramatically easier for patients. And then this other thing that you see up here is, yeah, well, what if the aneurysm involves a lot of the artery? What if it involves a section of the artery where there are a lot of branches to the liver, to the bowels, to the kidneys? Well, we now have specialized endovascular grafts that have holes in them or little branches in them, and we can begin to connect up all the dots. If you would have told somebody something like that 20 years ago or 15 years ago when Juan Perotti was hand-making chicken wire and Dacron, people would have told you you're crazy. And of course, we still use these coil embolizations, particularly in the brain. You get these little funny shaped aneurysms in the brain. We negotiate a little catheter right into that region. We drop a coil in that region. Perfect. We do not have to do a craniotomy. We don't have to do brain surgery. We just drop it right in there and you're healed. Okay. I guess that's really all I had for today. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone had. And once again, thank you very much for hosting me today.
Wonderful. Dr. Dewick, thank you very much. All right, so now we all know about peripheral vascular disease and what those aortic aneurysms mean, and more importantly, how to get them fixed. Thank you very much, Dr. Dewick. Wonderful session.